My name is Mei Lin. I want you to understand something before this story begins, because it will help you understand why the ending looks the way it does. I am not a person who believes in revenge the way movies portray it, the loud kind, the theatrical kind, the kind where someone stands in a doorway and delivers a monologue while the villain crumbles. I grew up learning that the most devastating thing you can do to someone who underestimated you is not to punish them. It is to surpass them so completely, so quietly, so irrevocably, that the story of their cruelty becomes a footnote in the story of your survival. I built a business empire in southern China starting from a borrowed phone and a notebook of observations. I did it without investors, without connections, without a family name that opened doors. And for years, the man who made it necessary had no idea we existed. But I am getting ahead of myself. The night it started, I was 9 years old. My brother Hao Jun was 7. The incense from our father's funeral had not yet finished burning. Our father, Zhao Jiming, had died quietly, the way men do when their hearts give out early from too much responsibility and too little peace. He was the second son in a family that preferred its first. He had married my mother not because the family approved, but because he loved her, and in the Zhao family, love was treated as a kind of cognitive failure. My mother, Chen Linyu, was educated. A graduate of a provincial university in Guangdong. The daughter of a schoolteacher. She came from what the Zhao family called nothing, meaning she came from people who worked with their hands and their minds instead of inheriting capital. She was precisely the kind of woman who made wealthy families nervous because she could look at a balance sheet and understand it without being taught, and because she asked questions that revealed how poorly the foundations of certain empires had been built. The Zhao family had never forgiven my father for choosing her. They simply waited for him to become irrelevant. They waited 3 days after his burial. Then my uncle Wenba, the eldest, the heir, the man who wore expensive shoes and laughed at jokes about poor people, came into the house with a sheaf of papers and the expression of someone doing an unpleasant but necessary administrative task. My mother asked what he was holding. He said the marriage registration had been filed incorrectly. That there were discrepancies in the provincial records. That the children, meaning me and Hao Jun, had not been formally entered into the family household registry. These were lies. We had been told this later, when we finally had access to a lawyer who cost almost nothing but had sharp eyes for contradiction. But that night, they were stated as fact, and facts require time to disprove, and time was exactly what we did not have. My grandfather, Zhao Guowei, never came outside. This is the detail that has stayed with me the longest, in all the years since. Not the uncle's words. Not my mother's face. Not the sound of the gates. What I remember is the light on in my grandfather's study window, and the shadow of a man sitting at a desk, and the stillness of that shadow. He knew. He had sanctioned this. And he chose the cowardice of distance, the clean hands of a man who lets others do what he has decided. I remember Wenba's voice. This family invests in heirs, he said. Not complications. The bags were already packed. They had done this before we arrived at the gate. My brother was barefoot. He had forgotten his shoes during the confusion and no one allowed him to go back. My mother was still wearing house slippers. She had answered the door expecting paperwork and found eviction. The gates closed. The rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived, the kind of heavy, relentless southern rain that fills the streets to the ankles and makes the world smell like wet concrete and defeated ambition. We stood outside my grandfather's compound with 3 garbage bags of clothing and a cracked plastic umbrella that could cover approximately one person's shoulders if that person stood very still. My mother stood very still. And then she said something I didn't fully understand until I was much older. She said, "Good. Now there is nothing left to lose." We moved into a room behind a shuttered textile warehouse in a neighborhood that smelled of machine oil and overcrowded kitchens. I want to describe this place accurately because the temptation when telling stories like this is to aestheticize poverty, to make it look purposeful and atmospheric from a distance, the way films do when they want you to feel sympathy without actually feeling discomfort. But poverty is not atmospheric. It is specific. It is mold along the ceiling that comes back no matter what you clean it with. It is a shared faucet down the hall where the water pressure depends on what hour it is and how many of the 8 families in the building are using it simultaneously. It is windows that let in winter air not because they're open but because the seals are gone, and the cold sits in the walls and floors in a way that makes the whole room feel like standing in a refrigerator that someone has left ajar. My mother found work in an illegal overnight garment workshop. This is something you should understand about women like my mother. They do not have the luxury of being broken by the things that break them. Being broken is a state that requires time and resources. You cannot grieve if there are children watching. You cannot collapse if collapsing means 3 days with no income and 2 children who cannot understand why the rice bag is empty. She hid her university degree certificate inside an old cooking pot at the back of a shelf. She said, "Someday that paper will mean something again." How June and I grew up in a particular way that I think is different from how most children grow. We grew up understanding that the world was a system before we understood it was supposed to be a home. We understood that resources had to be tracked, that every expense was a calculation, that the question, "Can we afford this?" was not rhetorical, it required an actual answer, worked out with actual numbers. By the time I was 11, I was reading shipping invoices we found discarded outside a logistics depot down the street. Not because anyone taught me. Because the numbers told a story and I had learned to listen to stories that other people threw away. How June took apart every broken appliance we found. A rice cooker someone had left by the dumpster. A fan with a bent blade. A water pump from a workshop that had gone out of business. He did not take them apart out of curiosity. He took them apart because they needed to be understood before they could be fixed, and fixed things could be sold, and sold things became money, and money became another week. One winter we burned old newspapers for warmth. Not books, we guarded books the way other families guard valuables. But newspapers, once read, become fuel, and there was never a shortage of things to burn. That winter, I overheard my mother crying. She thought we were asleep. She waited until she was certain of it. I stayed very still and listened, not because I wanted to, but because I understood that this was a private thing that belonged only to her and the dark, and that the only respectful response was to let her have it. After a while the crying stopped. Then I heard her say, quietly, to no one or to my father or to herself. "They will never beg. I will make sure of it. They will never stand at any gate again and wait for permission." That sentence became the architecture of our entire lives. School was the one place where class disappears if you are fast enough and precise enough. I was both. At school I was quiet in the way that confident people can afford to be quiet, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who is deciding when to say it. I studied everything, mathematics, yes, but also logistics, geography, industrial production. The subjects that most students found dry were the ones I found most useful because they described the actual mechanics of how the world moved things from one place to another, and how control over that movement was the real source of wealth in a manufacturing economy. How June was different. He struggled with abstract theory but could understand any physical system by touching it. He had a mechanic's intuition. The ability to feel through his hands what was wrong and what the correction required. At 14, he repaired a broken fermentation temperature controller for a small soy factory owner who lived in our building. Not because he knew about fermentation. Because he understood the electrical system, and the electrical system had a fault, and faults can be corrected if you are patient and precise. The factory owner paid him. Then told the owner of the soy paste operation across the street. Who told a pickled vegetable producer he knew in the next district. I watched this happen and understood something important. Every factory in southern China ran on 2 things, the machines that made the product, and the components and materials those machines required to keep running. The machines got the attention. The components were invisible. And invisible things that everyone depends on are, when you think carefully, more powerful than visible things that everyone notices. Wealth, I began to understand, does not live in companies. It lives behind them. We were not dramatic about how we started. There was no grand vision. No investor meeting. No business plan written in a brightly lit co-working space. There was a notebook. I began documenting connections, which factories needed which components, where those components were manufactured, what the pricing structure was, and most importantly, where the inefficiencies were. A factory in District 4 was paying 40% more for packaging materials than a factory in District 7 for the same quality. They didn't know this because they were not talking to each other and they had no reason to. Each factory owner saw his world as his own sealed economy. Nobody was looking at the system. I was looking at the system. Our first business was not a company. It was an introduction. I connected the District 4 factory to a packaging supplier I had found through 6 weeks of evening research. I charged a small coordination fee. They both saved money. They were happy. They told others. How June, by this point, had become the person factories called when machines broke down. He was 20, precise, and cheaper than certified technicians because he had no certifications, only results. While he worked on machines, he observed. He reported back to me. Which components failed most often? Which materials degraded fastest? Which suppliers were reliable and which were not? We reinvested everything. No new clothes. No better apartment, for longer than was probably necessary. My mother asked us once why we wouldn't move to somewhere nicer. I said, because every yuan we spend on comfort is a yuan that doesn't become leverage. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, your grandfather would recognize that sentence. It was not a compliment. It was a reminder. By the time I was 24, our supply network, still nameless, still faceless, still operated through an intermediary business name that gave nothing away, controlled coordination across dozens of factories. By 26, we had moved into specialty polymers and industrial solvents. Not manufacturing them. Routing them. Understanding the logistical channels so precisely that we could guarantee delivery windows that larger, slower brokers could not. Reliability is more valuable than scale. This was the lesson. Because a factory that cannot get its packaging resin on Thursday does not care that you saved them money in March. They care that their production line is about to stop. And the person who guarantees it will not stop is worth more than the person who gave them a good deal once. We became, in the language of the industry, a critical tier. We did not announce this. We did not advertise it. We were roots. Not branches. I was 31 when I found it. We had grown large enough that our financial operations required an analyst. A young woman named Fong Yu, meticulous, unshowy, exactly the kind of person you want reviewing accounts, was auditing our client dependency reports when she flagged something. There's a pattern in the Tier 2 vendor list, she said, setting the printed report on my desk. 7 of our largest indirect clients share a parent company. I looked at the name. Guowei Industrial Group. For a moment the room was very still. 22 years had passed since I stood at those gates in house slippers and rain. 22 years since my grandfather sat in a lit study window and chose the cowardice of silence. I had not spoken his name in years, not because I had forgotten it, but because I had made it irrelevant to my daily calculations. I told Fong Yu to step outside. Then I sat alone with the report. The supply chain was clear once you saw it. Our logistics network fed 7 factories that were Tier 2 vendors to Guowei's flagship manufacturing operations across 3 provinces. We didn't supply Guowei directly. We supplied the suppliers who supplied Guowei. The relationship was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking at the entire system from outside. But supply chain disruptions do not care about the layers between cause and effect. They move upstream like water. If we withheld materials from those 7 factories for 10 days, just 10 days, Guowei's 3 major production lines would face critical input shortages. The stock implications alone would be significant. The board implications would be worse. At Guowei's scale, in an industry where reputation for delivery reliability was everything, a visible supply failure would not be a small quarterly problem. It would be the kind of thing that redefines a company's decade. I called Hao Jun. He came to the office that evening and reviewed the same report. He sat across from me for a long time. He was 30 now, quiet in the particular way of men who were once barefoot and hungry and who never let themselves forget it. He said, "We could stop every machine he owns." The sentence sat between us. I thought about the rain. The garbage bags. The house slippers. A borrowed umbrella over my mother's head. The mold on the walls of a room behind a shuttered warehouse. Newspapers burning for warmth. I thought about power. Not the feeling of it. The decision about what to do with it. "We could," I said. And then I said nothing else for a long time. Because the most important decisions I have ever made in my life were made in silence, not in anger. Guowei Industrial Group had been experiencing something that their operations team could not fully explain. During the great supply instability that had disrupted southern China's manufacturing sector over the previous 18 months. A period of shortages, logistics breakdowns, and vendor failures that had cost several conglomerates significant production time and market position, Guowei's core operations had remained, by industry standards, remarkably stable. Not because of anything Guowei had done. Because of us. We had, without being asked and without advertising the fact, routed around the disruptions. We had rebalanced the supply channels to ensure that the 7 factories in our network maintained input stability. This was not charity. It was what we did for all our clients. But the effect, upstream, was that Guowei's supply chain held when others were failing, and their operations team didn't fully understand why. My grandfather, Zhao Guowei, 74 years old now, still the patriarch, still the billionaire, still the man who had sat at his desk while his grandchildren were pushed into the rain, told his operations director that he wanted to meet whoever was running the supply coordination that had kept them operational. He wanted to understand the architecture. Perhaps absorb it. Perhaps acquire it. We received the meeting request through an intermediary. I read it twice. Hao Jun called me the moment he received his copy. I could hear in his voice the thing that was also in mine, not excitement. Something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a circle closing, not violently, but with the slow, inevitable geometry of things that have been building for a long time. We accepted. I did not tell my mother we were going. I drove there alone, early, and parked on the street outside the compound for a few minutes before Hao Jun arrived. The walls were the same. The gates were taller than I remembered. Children always miscale the things that loom over them. I went inside as the founder of a supply network that controlled critical channels across southern China's manufacturing sector. I went in with our lawyer behind us and our documentation in order and our numbers so clean they required no explanation. I went in as someone who had not needed their permission for 22 years. The difference between walking out of those gates as a child and walking back through them as an adult is not a feeling of triumph. I want to be honest about this. It was more like completing a proof in mathematics. Not emotional. Just correct. The lobby of Guowei Industrial's headquarters was all imported marble, high ceilings, and the kind of hushed efficiency that money wears as a uniform. The ancestral portrait was on the wall. My grandfather, perhaps 20 years younger in the painting, in a dark formal jacket. Austere. Successful. The look of a man who believes his legacy is already settled. We were brought to a conference room on the 5th floor. We were introduced formally as the directors of the Supply Coordination Network, our business names, our credentials, the summary of our operational reach. My grandfather arrived with his operations director and 2 board members. He was older than I expected. The walk was careful in the way that powerful old men walk when they do not want anyone to notice that they have become careful. He had my father's jaw, or perhaps my father had had his, and seeing it across the table did something in my chest that I chose not to examine until later. He was gracious. He praised the architecture of our logistics network with the specific appreciation of a man who understands industrial systems. He asked about our risk models, our vendor qualification process, our redundancy planning. He said we had accomplished in 15 years what his own procurement division had been trying to build for 30. And then he said, and I have replayed this sentence more times than I will ever admit, he said, "My family should have produced people like you." I spent my life building an empire, and I wonder sometimes whether the ones who should have inherited it were lost somewhere along the way. He did not say it as a confession. He said it as a rhetorical observation, the kind that powerful men make when they're trying to seem reflective in front of a boardroom. Hao Jun's jaw tightened slightly. I watched it happen. I kept my eyes on my grandfather and said nothing. Then the door opened, and my mother entered. I had called her that morning after all. I had not told her to come, but I had told her where we would be, and what it was, and she had decided on her own. She was 61 years old, wearing a clean, dark qipao, her hair fully gray, and the expression of a woman who has been conserving something for a very long time and is deciding whether today is the day she spends it. She stopped just inside the door. My grandfather looked at her. The operations director frowned at the interruption. And then, before recognition, before understanding, the old housekeeper who had been arranging tea service in the corner turned from the table and looked up. The teapot slipped from her hand. It didn't fall. She caught it. But the near drop was enough. My grandfather followed her eyes. And I watched him understand. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Slowly, the way understanding comes when it carries 22 years of implication. He looked at my mother. He looked at me. He looked at Hao Jun. And something happened in his face that I do not have a precise word for. It was not guilt, exactly. Guilt has a quality of surprise. What crossed his face was more like the look of a man who has lived long enough to see a debt he always knew existed finally arrive at his door in the form it was always going to take. The room was very quiet. We moved to a smaller room. Just him, just us, just the particular silence of a family reckoning that has no audience. He expected, I think, to be confronted with evidence. Documents. Accusations. The language of legal disputes and wounded inheritance claims. He sat across from us with the composure of a man braced for attack, the composure of someone who has been in many difficult rooms and survived them by staying still. I placed our supply network documentation on the table. Not litigation documents. Operational documents. Maps of logistics channels. Client lists. Vendor agreements. The full technical picture of what we had built and where it sat relative to his own industrial operations. I let him look at it for a long time. "You understand what you're looking at," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked up. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. "You supply my vendors." "We supply a significant portion of the regional supply chain," I said. "Your vendors are part of that chain. As are vendors of 12 of your competitors, and several of your partners. We do not have a particular position on Guowei Group. We have a structural position. If you withdrew, we won't." Silence. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "No." He looked at my mother, who had sat in the corner of the room in complete silence since she entered. She was looking not at him but at the window, at the gray afternoon sky above the manufacturing district. "Lin Yu," he said. She turned. "I made a mistake," he said. She regarded him for a moment. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has heard inadequate sentences before and knows when to save her energy. "You made a decision," she said. "You were conscious when you made it. Your windows were lit. I saw you." Hao Jun put his hand on the table. Not aggressively. Just present. My grandfather looked at him, at this boy, now a man, who had once forgotten his shoes at a gate, and I watched something happen behind his eyes. Not remorse, exactly. The specific grief of a man who realizes he authored a loss he cannot recover. I had prepared for this meeting for years in various unconscious ways. I had thought about what I wanted from it, and the answer I always arrived at was the same, not his apology, which would cost him nothing. Not his money, which would complicate what we had built independently. Not the acknowledgement, which would not be believed unless it took a form that required something real from him. I told him what we wanted. We would formalize the supply relationship with Guowei Group. A long-term operational agreement, transparent and documented, that guaranteed supply stability for their key production inputs. In exchange, we required one thing that had nothing to do with us directly. The Zhao Family Foundation, funded through the group, would establish a permanent charitable trust for displaced women and children in inheritance disputes. Specifically, housing assistance, legal support, and child education funding. Structured to operate in perpetuity, with independent governance, so that no future decision by any family member could eliminate it. He stared at the documentation. This is what you want, he said. Not equity. Not the company name. Not. We have what we built, I said. We don't want what you built. We want what your decision made necessary for other people never to need again. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the glass, the afternoon had turned gray and wet. Southern rain. The particular kind that comes without dramatic announcement and stays for hours. My grandfather signed the framework agreement. Not quickly. Not easily. He held the pen for a long time before he used it. I found Hao Jun standing at the window at the end of the hallway afterward. He was looking out at the rain. He was 30 years old and he had never recovered fully from the cold of that particular winter when we had burned newspapers for warmth, and on damp days he still rubbed his knuckles in a habit he didn't know he had. I stood next to him. Is it enough? He said. I thought about this carefully, the way I have always thought about the important questions, not for the first impression but for the accurate answer. It's not about enough, I said. He gave us nothing and we built everything. Enough was a long time ago. Hao Jun looked at the rain for a while. Then he said, she would have been proud. She is proud, I said. She's in the building. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who was released from something in that moment, not healed, not resolved, but released. A different thing. I thought about my mother's university degree certificate still inside the cooking pot on the shelf in the kitchen of her apartment. She had moved, 2 years earlier, to a clean small house in a quiet district. Sunlight in the mornings. A garden with 5 plants she called by names that weren't their botanical names. She still had the cracked plastic umbrella. It was by the door. For memory? I had asked her once. No, she had said. For rain. In the years that followed, Guowei Group grew stronger. The supply architecture we had built, and which now operated as a formal infrastructure partner to their operations, was a genuine competitive advantage. Other conglomerates faced continued disruption. Guowei, protected structurally by the supply network we had spent 20 years building, maintained stability through 3 consecutive difficult industry cycles. My grandfather understood what this meant. He understood it not as an act of charity but as a daily demonstration of the scale of what had been thrown away the night he sat at a lit window and said nothing while a woman in house slippers stood in the rain with 2 children and 3 garbage bags. We did not take the family name back. This was a deliberate decision, and I will try to explain it accurately. The Zhao name carries with it the history of the Zhao family, its decisions, its values, its record. We had built something under a different name, by different principles, and what we had built was ours in a way that the Zhao name could never be. To reclaim it would have been to agree that it was worth reclaiming. We did not believe that. Our company bore the name we chose. Our work bore the mark of what we had decided to be. The Zhao Family Foundation was established within 8 months of the agreement. The first families it assisted were housed within the year. There is a building in Guangdong Province, a clean, ordinary building, nothing spectacular, where women and children in legal disputes over inheritance and family registration can receive housing, legal aid, and education funding. My grandfather visited it once, I am told. He did not announce the visit. He went on a weekday morning and walked through the rooms and spoke briefly with a caseworker. What he said has not been reported to me, and I have not asked. What he knows, I think, is this. Every person helped by that building is a daily reminder of what was chosen in a courtyard 22 years ago. The rain was real. The children were real. The gates were real. And the world that the children built afterward was more real than anything his silence imagined. My mother came to visit our offices last spring. She walked through the building the way she walks through everything, observing, not performing, taking in what is true rather than what is presented. She stopped at the window of my office overlooking the city. She looked out at the industrial districts below, the factory rooftops, the logistics corridors, the infrastructure of a manufacturing economy that we had made ourselves critical to. She said, "When you were small, I burned newspapers to keep you warm." I said, "I know." She said, "I used to think, when the fire went out and the room got cold again, that I had failed to protect you." I waited. "But you don't protect children by keeping them from cold," she said. "You protect them by making sure they know the cold is survivable." She looked at me. "You survived it," she said. "And then you built something that meant neither of you would ever be cold again." She touched my face in the way mothers do when they are looking at something that cost them enormously and was worth it. Then she went to find How June to argue about what he was eating for lunch. I stood at the window after she left, looking at the city. Somewhere in the northern part of that city, my grandfather was at his desk. He was old now, and some of the people closest to him said he had become quieter in the years since our meeting. That he looked differently at certain things. That he did not speak about legacy the way he used to. I did not celebrate this. I did not mourn it. I simply noted it, the way I note everything. As a fact, with its correct weight, filed in the proper place. Some people ask me whether I regret not taking more. Not taking public exposure, not taking legal action, not taking the name, not taking the equity, not taking the full visible accounting. I tell them, I took the only thing that can never be disputed or diluted or dismissed. I took the future. They removed our names from their family registry. So we wrote them into the architecture of the industry they depended on to breathe. We held the power to end everything they built. We chose instead to outlast it. And in the silence of that choice, the restraint, the precision, the refusal to be small even in victory, we became something no gate has ever been built high enough to keep out.